Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We'll start with the third panel, which will be the keynote address of Dr. Timothy Furnish, consultant to the United States military and RIMA. His subject will be Sufies versus Salafis, winning friends and interdicting enemies in Islamic Africa. Timothy Furnish is a U.S. Army veteran whose doctorate is in Islamic, African, and world history. His research specialization are Mahdism and Islamic eschatology, both spurred by his studies of African messianic jihads, most notably that of Muhammad Ahmad, the Sudanese Mahdi. He taught World and Middle East history at the college level in the US for 7 years, then became a consultant to the US military and intelligence community on Mahdism, transnational Islamic movements, and Islamic sects. In 2008, he gave a presentation on Sunni Mahdism in Tehran, Iran, and was fortunately allowed to return to the US. And we are fortunate to have him here. Please, Dr. Timothy.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank everyone here. It's after lunch, so if you nod off and don't pay attention, I won't be offended. I used to be a college professor, so. Anyway, greetings to everyone, and thank all of you excellencies, ambassadors, and folks attending. And I want to especially thank Dr. Moshe Tegmata, who brought me over from the States. This is a wonderful opportunity, and any excuse to come to Israel is a good one, in my opinion. So, but this wasn't just an excuse. So, let me just say a couple of things briefly. As I say on some of those TV shows and certain publications, these views are mine, not the views of the U.S. government or the U.S. military. Although I sometimes think they should be, which is why I do what I do. But I'm not here in an official capacity, so keep that in mind. This is an American view, so it's been Israeli view and African view in both today. So I'll try not to be typically ugly American, as they say. I hope to avoid that. But just briefly, I consult both to Special Operations Command and to Africa Command occasionally. Basically my job is more or less a brainstormer, try to help people think about things they don't normally think about. And as most of you probably know, with the U.S. in general and the U.S. military in particular, we're often big on storming and not big on brains. So I try to help with that as much as I can. So one of the issues, interestingly enough, that American analysts, both in the military and outside the military, have been interested in recently, certainly since 9/11, has been the issue of course, different Islamic sects, and particularly the issue, the Salafis, of course, are always an interest to everyone. The Sufies also have become interesting to the United States, certain sectors of the military intelligence community. On several levels, and it was very interesting the story about the Senegalese Sufis that came to Israel. I wish the United States would do things like that. It would probably be helpful. But the usual caveats apply here. I realize as I'll go through this, you'll see that I realize this. To speak of Sufism is a bit problematic because just like there are many Islams, there are many Sufisms, as we know. Tasawwuf has been variegated for centuries. And for that matter, there are various brands of Salafis. So I will touch on that issue, but up front, let me acknowledge that I understand that. Of course, from a just historical, relational view, the issue of Sufis versus Salafis, ideally from an Islamic point of view, should not exist, right? As per the hadith here, Muslims are not supposed to fight other Muslims, nor even point weapons toward each other, of course. But there is reality and there is theory or doctrine. And of course, this would apply if I were giving a talk on certain Christian sects fighting each other historically or in the modern world. But that's not my purpose here. So just, once a historian, always a historian. Could take me out of the academy, but I still lean toward historical background. So, this is nothing new to most of you, but just some examples of famous conflicts, Muslim against Muslim, of course, from the early Islamic community. And of course, most of these I focused on, these examples are from the Central Islamic lands, some in Africa, of course, the Sokoto Caliphate, for instance. But most of them are from the Central Islamic lands. And then, of course, at the bottom, the topic here that I want to get to. Now, Sufis and Salafis are at odds, not just in certain parts of Africa, as we'll see, but in two other major venues, of course, Pakistan, South Asia, and also in Chechnya and the Caucasus regions. So it's not something that's just focused in Africa, but it is, of course, something that's very important in Africa, both historically and policy-wise. Now, entire courses are taught on Sufism, and entire courses could be taught on Salafism. But just in general, and again, I realize that I don't want to engage in reductio ad absurdums, but we do have to sort of boil this down since it's Hanukkah and we don't want to be here all day. At root, what are the basic doctrinal bases or beliefs of Sufism and Salafism? Sufism, Islamic mysticism, tends toward mystical, esoteric beliefs, as opposed to, as the theologians say, exoteric. The letter of the law is important, but it's not always the most important thing. The letter of the Koren, for instance, not always the most important thing. Sometimes the inner meaning is more important. An experience of Allah, some kind of direct experience of the divine, is also very important, sometimes super added to adherence to Sharia, sometimes taking precedence over adherence to Sharia. And again, we're talking hundreds of Sufi orders over centuries across many continents. But in general, these are characteristics of the common. The organization is the Turuq or Tariqat, under generally charismatic shapes, and Islam has been famously described as peaceful but not, Sufism has been famously described as peaceful but not pacifist. So, a point that I'll return to in a moment. Salafism, on the other hand, the term comes from the idea of emulating the Salaf, the pious ancestors. The focus is generally on Tawheed, the unity, strict monotheism, which of course is a cudgel that the Salafis often use against the Sufis, saying they violate belief in strict monotheism by adherence to shrines or frequenting shrines and believing in their sheikhs, baraka, and such. There's a great deal of talk in the States, in the military and other sectors, about how do you differentiate Salafis from groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, we could be here all day talking about that. But I think in general, it's safe to say that the Brotherhood tends to be less concerned in Islamic purity than do the Salafis. And of course, there are points of overlap, but I think that's probably accurate. In general, Salafis tend to be rejectionist toward the Western Enlightenment, particularly toward, of course, the key concept of the separation of, we would say, church and state. In this case, we would say the separation of mosque and state is not accepted by most Salafis. And they see Sufi veneration of sheikhs, as I was saying, dhikr, the attempt to achieve fana, unity, merging with the divine as innovation that is not acceptable in Islam. So, and I again could go on and on about these two, but I think at base that explains the general differences between the Sufi orders and the Salafis. Salafis in Africa, and again, a lot of you will know this better than I do, and I just touched on sort of the surface. But I think it is safe to say that there's jihadist and non-jihadist Salafism in Africa, like there is in other parts of the world. And, you know, it's a bit problematic trying to define, I think in some ways, Yanazala, but I think it's safe to say that in general it tends toward non-jihadist view of Salafism, although there were exceptions to that. The Al-Nur party in Egypt, of course, was a Salafi party that was in power with the Muslim Brotherhood until recently, the junior partner. And then groups like Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya in Sudan. On the other hand, you have groups that are Salafi in nature, that are overtly and proudly jihadist. Any of the Al-Qaeda affiliates, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, I put a question mark there because we're not exactly sure what their status is these days, but before the ouster of Gaddafi, they were in this category. Of course, Ansar Sharia in Maghreb, Ansar Din in Mali, Boko Haram, and Ansarul, which has just recently surfaced as an offshoot or a different branch of Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab. So, and then we could add to that Salakan, I guess, in the Central African Republic, and then some of the jihadist groups that have come out operating in Sinai in recent years. And of course, just, you know, again, most of you probably know this, but in terms of activity, Salafis are fond of bulldozing Sufi shrines, and doing other more heinous things to other Muslims and to Christians, as with Boko Haram. The United States, obviously, folks in the States and elsewhere, but particularly in the States, are concerned about what might be done. Now, there have been some in the United States who have presented Sufis as purely, as has been said for me, presented as Quakers with beards. And if you don't know what Quakers are a very peaceful, pietist American sect. Protestantism, very pacifist, as a matter of fact. And this does describe many Sufis. This, however, does not describe all Sufis, particularly historically. For 400 years or so, from the 16th century or so up into the early 20th century, in fact, it can be argued that the main Muslim-based resistance ideology to Western imperialism and Western colonialism was that of the Sufis, as articulated in jihad. And then, of course, there have been many Sufi-based jihads in Africa. If you look at the situation historically, Usman Dan Fodio's famous one, of course, founding the Sokoto Caliphate, Al-Hajj Omar, and various others, Ahmadou Ba, Muhammad Al-Amin. The most famous two, probably, of course, being Usman Dan Fodio's and that of Muhammad Ahmed in Sudan, who, before he was a Mahdi, or the Mahdi, according to his followers, was a very prominent Sufi. And of course, in North Africa, the main opposition to the Italian colonialists in Libya was that led by Umar al-Mukhtar and the Sufies. And then over in the Horn of Africa in Somalia, you had the so-called Mad Mullah, Mohammed bin Abdullah Hassan, fighting the British primarily. So I bring this up because, again, Sufis are often portrayed as purely peaceful, and most of them are in the modern world. But historically, that's not always been the case. And here, this is the best map I could find. I apologize. This is showing roughly between 1,500 and 1,900 areas of Sufi resistance. Resistance was not futile, according to the Sufis. And you see Africa, particularly the purplish area, sort of blue up there, isn't it? Is mainly, if you can see down the corner, Naqshbandi Mujahideen, the Naqshbandi order, which of the hundreds of Sufi orders, probably, arguably, has been the one most inclined toward jihad in the classic sense of fighting against infidels. But you see in Africa the areas of the Mahdiya, the Sudanese Mahdiya, the Sufies, some of the ones in West Africa that I mentioned. So, again, in much of the early modern period, up until, and for world historians, that's modern, up to 1900. For much of that period, the Sufi orders, many of them, have been engaged in not just pious, sort of passive resistance, but an active resistance, and often armed resistance to their opponents. And their opponents in this period, primarily, not always, but primarily being European colonialists. Muhammad Ahmed in Sudan, for example, he wasn't too fond of Charles Gordon. Well, he actually was fond of Charles Gordon up until he had his head separated from his body. But Muhammad Ahmed in Sudan fought against, of course, the Ottomans. Sometimes Sufi jihads were against other Muslims, and sometimes the Muslim establishments. So, no one knows what percentage or how many of the world's 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims are Sufi. This is some information from Pew, the Pew Research Institute in the States, which last year, I think it was summer of 2012, did quite a large statistical survey across, I believe it was 38 Muslim countries, and about different Muslim beliefs. And one of the beliefs that they actually asked about, was, do you belong to a Sufi order? Now, we could methodologically pick that apart, I think. I mean, it could be that you occasionally show up, at a zikr, or it may be that you're there every day and you're, attached to the sheikh and you're very involved. And so they don't control for the sort of degree of devotion, I guess you could say. But this is what percentage of Muslims in these various countries self-identify as belonging to a Sufi order. And the thing that, of course, jumps out at you here, Senegal jumps out at you if you can't see it, but is the percentage of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa that say they are Sufis is much higher on average than the rest of the Islamic world. And I'm not good at math. I'm a historian, but I tried to sort of disaggregate this, and altogether, for the average across all the countries was 18.7%, about 19% across the Islamic world. Again, I think this is a pretty representative sample. If you see, they have several of the stands in Central Asia, they have Southeast Asia, they have South Asia, Egypt, Lebanon, some of the countries in the Middle East, and then many in, of course, Africa. So it's a fairly representative study in that regard. But across the whole span of the Islamic world, almost 20% of Muslims say that they are in some way affiliated with the Sufi order. And I think this was, I know analysts that still don't believe this. They refuse to believe this. They somehow don't like this because they like to think of Sufism as a, sort of superstitious relic of a bygone era, and that and these are Western non-Muslim analysts. But these are the numbers that we have. In sub-Saharan Africa, the average for all of the countries comes out to about 35%. And I know, of course, that Senegal really sort of skews the number upward because so many folks in Senegal say they belong or affiliated with the Sufi order, Tijani and otherwise, right? Again, I think this is telling because it says that Sufism is very important. I know there's a Gulf think tank that I have done some work for called Enigma, which I can't remember what that stands for now, but I've done some work for them, and some of the folks there, I proposed doing some work on Sufis, and they sort of brushed it aside. No one's Sufi anymore. It's an irrelevant issue. So I thought that was rather strange, but that was their view. But I think that clearly is an incorrect view. From an American point of view, the United States has been trying to find, Muslim allies, certain Muslim allies from its point of view. Certainly since 9/11, one could probably go back earlier than that, arguably, but for the sake of discussion, certainly since 9/11, certainly since our invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And from the point of view of some American analysts and policymakers, why would Sufism seem to be why would the Sufis seem to be a useful ally against the Salafis? Well, just sort of doing ledgers here. On the positive side, the Sufis do tend to be less obsessed with Islamic purity and Quranic literalism than Salafis. Again, going back to the issue of what's more important when you interpret the Quran, the exoteric or the esoteric, the Zahiri or the Batini meaning, and Sufis tend toward the inner. Often more tolerant and willing to work with Christians, more tolerant of Christianity and willing to work with Christians. Sufism, I think, arguably can be said, of course, it's legitimately Muslim. The Sufi orders have existed for at least a millennium, if not longer. In fact, one could argue that the Sufis have been around longer than the Salafis, I think, quite plausibly. And one could say that that's a legitimate, obviously, a very legitimate and historic form of Islam that in some ways is more legitimate than the modernist sort of Salafi view. It's Sufism, the Tariqat have an organization in place, and they can often get things done. An example I'll come to in a moment, perhaps folks would like to talk about afterwards, the activity of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the pan-Sufi umbrella organization in Somalia, which has been opposed to al-Shabaab. And put this in modern terms, Sufis are not afraid to use hard as well as soft power. Again, soft power I'm positing as the idea of truly moderate Islam, and the hard power being not being adverse to occasionally going beyond mere persuasion, as has happened with ASJ and Somalia. The backwards, again, and I have Muslim friends that believe this. The Sufis are sort of backward and superstitious. There are Sufi snake handlers just like there are Christian snake handlers, and those of us that aren't snake handlers tend to view them both with a bit of a jaundiced eye. And the Salafis' defense, they often are very highly educated, often highly educated lay people, often highly educated in Saudi or Egyptian universities, and willing to, share that education and training with folks in other places like Africa. And this is something that has tended to, in certain contexts, in Africa and other places, to stand them in good stead. They are often much more educated than the Sufis, not always, but often. And the Salafis, the Sufis have tended, and again, I realize that I'm overgeneralizing for the sake of discussion, but allow me that for now. You can skewer me afterwards if you'd like. Sufis, in general, have tended to remain apolitical, certainly in the modern world. There have been exceptions to that. Interestingly enough, under the revolutionary regime, and then even under Nasser in Egypt, Sufis were officially supported. Nasser much preferred the Sufis, especially the ones that were affiliated with Al-Azhar, to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Sufis tend to prefer remaining apolitical, but not always. And it may be that they may not have a chance, they may not have a choice in remaining apolitical in the future if they hope to do anything to counter the Salafis. And again, it's interesting that, and some of you know this, that if you look at the history of Salafism and Sufism, there actually is some overlap. Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida, the famous Egyptian thinkers, early 20th century. Muhammad Abduh probably a bit more, but Rashid Rida was not opposed to Salafism per se, was not opposed to Sufism per se, it was simply opposed to what he considered to be excess, Sufi excess. He famously said, even if you see a man flying, meaning a Sufi, have no confidence in him until you know whether or not he obeys Sharia. So, there are some examples of Salafis who are not averse to Sufism. This was particularly the case with a couple of Muslim Brotherhood thinkers in Syria who were affiliated with particularly the Naqshbandi order, but this is outside of our purview. So, and just a few examples of the situation in some African countries that we have looked at from my purge in the States. Mali, of course, situation in Mali, we all know what's happened recently there. It has a very low percentage of Sufis. In fact, in that survey, it's on the very bottom. There are Qadiris and Tijanis with some offshoot suborders. And some interesting sort of neo-Sufi movements developing in Mali, like that of Adama Yakuye, who says he's a Sufi but belongs to no particular tariqa, sort of ecumenical toward all branches of Islam as well as toward Christians. And then you have, and this confuses a lot of folks in the West, besides the Salafi group, Ansar Din, you have a Sufi group called Ansar Din in Mali under Sheikh Hadara. So, in Nigeria, of course, Qadiris and Tijanis in large numbers, and Sufis in northern Nigeria in particular. And one of the most important things about the Sufis, which I think is analytically important, is their transnational nature. Sufis generally are not limited to one country, and in this they greatly resemble Salafi networks, but of course they pre-exist them by many years in most cases. Qadiris came into conflict with the Yana Zala movement in Nigeria in the 1980s, which is in many ways a Salafi a Salafi movement, Salafi tinge certainly. And you know, much like in North Africa with the Sufies, for example, in Libya, Sufies in Libya have a great deal of cachet, or they have historically in Libya. The first president of Libya, of course, was a member of that order, but it mainly stemmed from the fact that the Sufies were opponents of the Italian occupiers, and many, and somewhat similarly in Nigeria, there was the great deal of Sufi association, of course, with Usman Dan Fodio. I don't know where that came from. It's a network threat, though. As long as it's not Bill Gates approves. So. Libya, the Sufies, of course, dominate the scene. In fact, 2011, spring of 2011, before Gaddafi was ousted, ousted, there was a very, very large conference held in Arlington, Virginia, near D.C., sponsored by the U.S. military, and I attended along with a lot of other people. Excuse me. And one of the, of course, major topics of discussion, the major topic of discussion was what will post-Gaddafi Libya look like. And one of the issues that was adduced, and we discussed to some extent, was to what degree should or could both the Sufies be brought into the ruling coalition. And again, as I mentioned, the Sunusi order, a great deal of legitimacy because they were the main opponents of Italian occupation. The first king was of the order. The Turks tend to be fond of the Sunusis because they were very pro-Ottoman in their day. And in fact, Gaddafi, a couple of years ago, in fact, it was just early in 2011, shortly before he ran into all those difficulties, Gaddafi had sponsored a Sufi conference, I believe it was in Benghazi, and trying to enlist sort of Sunusi support over against, I think he had an inkling of what was coming, and he was trying to find someone on his side besides readers of his green book. It didn't work, but he tried. So, Sunusis are interesting. Of course, some of you probably know the Sunusi Dawa, the Sunusi doctrines are, in many ways, very conservative, tending in some ways almost towards Salafism, but yet they're Sufi. So, that idea was bandied about a bit. And again, not in terms of, from the American point of view, maybe Bill Gates doesn't like me now. There we go. Not in terms of, the United States dictating to anyone, but in terms of the United States trying to find, again, moderate Muslims with whom the United States can work in various contexts, particularly in Africa, because Africa is very, very important. Horn of Africa, again, I'm sure many of you know this. Major orders in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And again, the United States, of course, has been involved to some extent with helping support in various ways Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, ASJ, the pan-Sufi group that has fought against the Shabab in East Africa. Another group that I should mention, and again, some of you know this, I'm sure many of you do, a group that is of very great interest to certain folks in American sectors is Ahmadiyya, the Ethiopians hyphen Lebanese Sufi order that is very sort of, again, ecumenical, Islamic, and is in many ways sort of a counterweight to Salafi thought. So it's a little different in Sudan because the Sudanese government is officially Islamic. I should say, is it North Sudan now or just Sudan? Sudan and South Sudan, right? It's not Northern Sudan, it's Sudan. Sudan and South Sudan, yes. But the Sudanese government, the Khartoum government, is of course officially Islamic, and thus Sufis are in a different position vis-a-vis the government than they are in a lot of African countries. So, Egypt, it's interesting. In the States, a lot of analysts don't put Egypt in Africa. Egypt is in the Middle East. So, in fact, if you look at these little maps that we have of, our imperial maps, Africa, all of Africa is an AFRICOM, part of the AFRICOM area, AO, area of operations. But Egypt is not. Egypt is part of CENTCOM, the Central Command. So you kind of sometimes have to grab people by the lapels and remind them, Egypt is actually in Africa. So no one knows, again, exactly how many Sufis there are in Egypt, except there are quite a number. I remember there was an article on Al-Ahram I saw, I guess last spring, that claimed there were 20 million Sufis in Egypt. And I thought that was a bit high, but maybe the Al-Ahram writer was trying to put a scare into the Brotherhood, I'm not sure. But I think it's safe to say there's probably 10 million Sufis in Egypt, over 80 million people, 70 million Muslim, so a substantial minority. And there are dozens and dozens of Sufi orders in Egypt. The most prominent, probably, the Rifa'is, and some of these others here that I've got. Did I put Egypt up? No. It'd be helpful if I let you follow along, wouldn't it? Sorry. There we go, Egypt. The Sufi orders, most of them, it seems, were on the side of the overturning of Brotherhood rule, on the side of Al-Sisi, the Copts, and Al-Azhar, over against the Salafis. And again, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because even in the brief period when the Brotherhood was in control, a number of Sufi shrines were destroyed in Egypt. Not so much in Cairo, but in some outlying towns, particularly in Sinai. It was tension, at least, and sometimes more than that. And as I mentioned, tensions with the Salafis, ideological ones, certainly go back to the time Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, as I mentioned. And also, as I mentioned, Nasser and Sadat supported the Sufis over against the Brotherhood. One of the major Sufi parties, if not the major Sufi party today in Egypt, or at least was as of a year or so ago, Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Misri, which was an outspoken critic, and actually stood in the Majlis election. I don't think it won any seats, but it actually exists. And there's a few other small Sufi parties in Egypt. So it's interesting that, again, Sufis are becoming, it seems, at least in Egypt and some other places, politicized and becoming involved in politics. Now, this is sort of the context that I was speaking about earlier. A number of American thinkers, I don't know if you've heard of Stephen Suleiman Schwartz. Stephen Schwartz is an American leftist of a Jewish family who converted to Islam. And then Sheikh Hisham Kabani is the Naqshbandi sheikh in, I think he's based in Washington, D.C. And then Bernard Lewis is involved in this, at least he was a few years ago before he got and even older. He's quite old, of course. But the key idea pushed by certain folks, and again, not just non-Muslims, two prominent Muslims here, and I should mention Schwartz is very, very involved with sort of Bosnian and Herzegovinian Sufism, and is one of the major American writers against Salafi and Wahhabi doctrines. The big idea that these folks tend to advance is that Sufism is the Islamic alternative to Salafism and Wahhabism, over against many American analysts and thinkers and journalists who will adduce instead sort of modernist, westernized, almost secularized Muslims. Folks like this tend to say, and I tend to agree with them, that the Islamic component of Salafi thinking being so prominent, so strong, it's not going to be countered or argued against or undermined by secularists. It's only going to be countered or undermined successfully by an equally strong, legitimately Islamic viewpoint, which Sufism represents. And here's some examples of some of the governments, some of the establishments in Africa doing things to help the Sufis. You see this a lot too. I mentioned earlier, remember Pakistan and Chechnya, particularly in Pakistan, there are always reports coming out of the Pakistani press about the government's trying to support this Sufi group or that Sufi group over against the Taliban. So, but you see, and obviously it's not quite as, usually in most cases in Africa, it's not quite as deadly an issue as it is if you're fighting the Taliban, although there's Boko Haram, of course. So that's some of what's going on. And one of the things that the U.S. military and some of the other folks in certain agencies have been thinking about is that, assuming arguendo that the United States should help Sufis in various contexts, particularly in Africa, what could the U.S. do? So I was involved with some folks that came up with some ideas. And again, some of these may just be useless and some may be crazy, but, bear with us, we're Americans. So, in Egypt, speak out for Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Masri. Maybe try to find ways to sponsor Sufi and Coptic discussions or forums at Al-Azhar. Again, of course, keeping in mind that sometimes the United States getting involved is the kiss of death. We're quite aware of that. In Libya, again, I mentioned there was a whole conference a couple of years ago on, it was on Libya, but one of the major elements of that was that it would probably be a good idea to have the Sudanese involved in the government. I think we've had exactly zero influence in that regard, but that idea was broached. Mali, the French sort of cut off any, headed off any other things the United States might have wanted to do. But one thing that we did discuss was it would probably be a good idea to help protect the libraries in Timbuktu so that nothing happens to them. Somalia, among other things, it would probably be a good idea to continue to support the Sufis over against Shabab. In Ethiopia, in Ethiopia, maybe talk to the government in Ethiopia about whether or not the Abashis or the Abashia are worth trying to find a way to assist in ways that don't, again, get them in trouble. Now, Nigeria, there was a very major paper put out by I believe it's a full colonel at the U.S. Army War College, Strategic Study Institute at the U.S. Army War College, that proposed that the idea that the U.S. should open additional consulates in the north of Nigeria, and I'm not going to speak to the wisdom of that. I put it here because it's been a major idea floating around, at least it was a year or two ago, floating around in American military circles. The ambassador might have something to say about that, but I will hasten to say this was not my idea. This is the sort of things, in general, I think, that it's, just to give you a representative idea, the sort of things, the sort of thinking that's going on among some sectors in the U.S. military. And again, I have this sort of tongue-in-cheek title here, but really, the United States, as I've said, for a decade or so, has really been, besides, trying to gain the confidence and trust and gain allies among certain Muslim-majority countries and the governments thereof, the United States has been trying to find sort of an ideological and organizational antidote, as I said earlier, vaccine or antidote or riposte or response, or put your own favorite noun in there, to Salafism. And some American policymakers have latched on the idea of Sufism. And of course, as we all know, Africa, as was discussed very eloquently this morning, Africa is very, very important in the 21st century on many levels, not least the fact that it is on the fault line, one could say, without being too Huntingtonian, between Christian and Islamic civilizations. Of course, we all know that there's fierce competition, we like to think strategic rivalry, right, for business and other areas of competition in China, in Africa, with China in the West, and then Iran being involved. But then, of course, we can't deny the fact that there are terrorist groups in certain areas of certain weak states and certain failed state in Africa. And again, I'm one of the people that, when I'm asked to talk about it, I tend to be on the side of saying, if you're looking to American audiences, policymaker, military, and otherwise, if you're looking for moderate Muslims, Sufis are a pretty good place to look and talk to folks. This last point I have here was sort of, I will give him credit, I sort of plagiarized it from the aforementioned Stephen Schwartz, who said in a venue about this topic that Sufis would not be the West mercenaries. And I don't think anyone, even in our military, is contemplating something like that. But he went on to say there could be perhaps its allies over against extremist groups, jihadist groups, many of which, of course, fall under the rubric of Salafism. And that could be either, armed or not, preferably not, but we all know the reality often requires that. So, in general, just some observations on the ideological and sometimes more than ideological battles going on in Africa and elsewhere between Sufis and Salafis. So, thank you. So I guess since I'm up here by myself, I get to do the questions. Is that right? All right. Yes, sir.
In light of what's happening now in Libya, wasn't it a mistake to destroy the Gaddafi regime?
Do I have to answer that?
Yes, sir.
It certainly has had negative unintended consequences. Would that sound John Kerry-esque enough? I don't know. I don't know if I'd say it was a mistake, but certainly much like getting rid of Saddam in Iraq. It unleashed, not to torture a metaphor, but it let the genie out of the lamp, and not necessarily a good one. whatever one wanted to say about Gaddafi and Saddam, they certainly kept jihadists in check. On the other hand, I mean, they're both dictators. They may have been benevolent dictators, but they're both dictators. And Gaddafi, additionally, was a rank heretic, right? You know, the Green Book. It certainly looks pretty nasty right now, I will say that, and knowing full well, of course, what happened to our ambassador and the other chaps there, which we still are not quite sure what happened. But I don't know that I would go so far as to say that it was a mistake, but it certainly, the United States, I love my country, but sometimes we do things without thinking sometimes. Like, well, I'll leave it at that. All right, yes, sir. So,
Thank you
yes, ma'am.
Thank you for this analysis.
Such as it was. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for a very interesting analysis of specific comparison. I think that we've seen history in recent years, two cases looking for the moderate partner in the Arctic, more that situation was not always. Sometimes you grow the monster out of this moderate partner. But if you, I'm going to not your academic side, but your consultant side, maybe talking to Sufi leaders, you do see Sufis in Egypt and other places, groups going back into politics or raising their involvement in politics. Are they interested to be this alternative, to be this armed or unarmed ally of the West? Are they presenting a will for that kind of dialogue, I would say? I don't know if I'm using the correct term.
Right. Yeah, what's their viewpoint, not just our viewpoint? I think a lot of times we don't know yet because we haven't asked. I mean, we've been too busy hanging out with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to talk to anyone else. And perhaps it would behoove Americans to talk to someone else besides just the Muslim Brotherhood. So. But it's a very good question, and I don't know if I'm giving you a very good answer, but I think the best I can say, outside of Somalia, where we know the situation there, I think that we just simply don't know. And I realize the United States is not going to go into some country and disregard the government and go talk to groups directly. Yeah, I realize that. We realize that. Yeah. But yeah, like for instance, I bring up the Egyptian Aznia political party. And are they interested in any degree of cooperation with the United States? I don't know, but I don't think we've ever asked, and it probably couldn't hurt to ask. Certainly through Al-Azhar or through whomever. I don't know. Invite the sheikh to the United States, like the sheikhs come to Israel. I mean, invite them over and talk to them. Show them around. Yes, sir.
So thank you for sharing in such a concise and focused way this information. I'm an Israeli and Canadian, but I also love your country. But your talk scares the hell out of me. In the following context, and you kind of alluded to it as well, is that sometimes U.S. involvement is a kiss of death. And we look at early support of Taliban in Afghanistan and early support of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So I'm scared that this kind of support for Sufism may turn Sufis into the next monster.
They turn the Sufis back into pure jihadists, as some of them were in the past. That's a good point, and I think I tacitly tried to acknowledge that. I tried to hedge this about with many caveats and say, and be hypothetical in the subjunctive case quite a bit. I understand what you're saying. I don't know how to allay your fears about the hell being scared out of you, but don't be scared on Hanukkah, right? So, no, but I understand what you're saying. I will say this, and again, I'm not an official spokesman for the administration. I didn't vote for this administration at the time, but I don't think I Syria. What did we do about Syria? If anything, I think the United States, certainly for the next few years, is going to be very much on the passive side. You know. But then, you know, with the next administration, we'll lurch to the other extreme because that's what we do. But I would say in the short term, the United States is very much on the sort of, maybe passive isn't the correct word, but that's kind of what I would tend to say. Everyone's remarkably awake for after lunch and late in the afternoon. So. Anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Timothy Furnish, for your illuminating, in-depth lecture. I just want to remark that the Sufis contributed a lot to the expansion of Islam in Africa. In fact, the Qadiriya in East Africa and the Tijaniya in West Africa. In fact, there were in the 18th century a huge empire of the Tijanis, and they diffused the order Tijaniya in West Africa. And I remember that, for example, in East Africa, what I have seen in the mosques of the Sufis, usually you find a lot of African non-Muslims around the mosque because they like to see the way of singing, the way of dancing, the way of all their ecstasy of the Sufis when they are dancing, using also the tambours which the other Salafis and the others, they don't like them. And afterwards, I used to see that many of them, non-Muslims, are coming to it was especially during the Mawlidi ceremonies. Mawlidi ceremonies, this is the birthday of the Prophet. And the Sufis are celebrating it not one time a year, but several times a year. And you see then the Africans coming there and are converted to Islam. Now I would like to apologize on behalf of Professor Galia Tzabar, which could not come because she did not feel well. So I volunteered to work instead. And we are continuing with our third panel. And first will be Dr. Reuven Paz, which will talk about the female's mutilations between the knife and the strife, Islam and social change in Africa. Dr. Reuven Paz has been researching the Arab and Muslim world and Palestinian society and politics in the past 40 years, focusing on Islam, Islamic ideology, and social developments in the modern Muslim world, including terrorism and fanaticism. He combines in his work the practical experience and dimension of a long service in the Israeli intelligence community with his academic research. In 2002, he founded the Project for the Research of Islamist Movement, PRISM, which contributed a lot to the understanding of the fanatic jihad, modern martyrdom, and the Islamic mind. In recent years, he started researching Muslim in Africa and the effect of the Arab-Muslim culture on Africa. Dr. Paz lectures on Islamic radicalism and Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya, and a member of RIMA. Please, Dr. Paz.
Thank you and good afternoon. The topic that I am going to talk about is not usually a topic that is presented in academic conferences and workshops. It's a very delicate issue, and until recently, especially in the Arab and Muslim world, there is, I would say, only silence regarding it. Not almost any protest, and it's not under debate. Why I am talking about it? During my research, for many years, I, from time to time, was trying to see especially two topics or two problems in the Arab and Muslim world that Islam, and in this case, we can talk, I'm talking about Sunni Islam, not the Shias, but Islam, and unlike what Professor Ehrlich said in the morning, there are some cases in which we can say Islam, and especially Islamic clerics, Islamic establishments, and Islamic scholars. There are two topics that from the beginning of Islam or Islamic history, the Muslim world could never cope with. And they are a mixture of cultural and religious questions. The first is, and I'm not going to talk about, the first is what we call in the West the killing for the honor of the family. I'm not going to talk about it. Maybe it deserves a conference in itself. This is also something that nobody is raising it as a serious issue, even though killing on this background are from time to time carried out also among Muslim, Arab and Muslim communities in the West, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Europe, etc. The second topic, which Islam cannot cope with, never did, and it's what I check from time to time is if there is any change in the attitude towards it, is what is called in the West female genital mutilation. And I will, in order to save time, I won't say the entire term. I will use the initials FGM. The practice of FGM is a problem, is a real problem, and as I mentioned earlier, from time to time I try to check what happens in this field. What is the reaction of the Muslim Islamic establishments or clerics Are there 50 pious men in Sodom, or 10 pious men, or 5, or 1, like Abraham was asking God in Genesis? Is there any pious cleric, that would stand up and oppose it clearly, openly, publicly? Because the subject is on the agenda in the field of questions that are answered as fatwas, as religious rulings by clerics. Somewhere in the air, there are a lot of questions about it. But it seems that, especially officially, there is silence. Now, this topic also touches, of course, the greater topic of the attitude towards women. And for my concern, I look mainly at the Arab world and Africa, and I try also to look at the effect of the Arab Muslim world, and whether we like it or not, almost all the changes, the new initiatives, the new reforms, the new ways of thinking in the Muslim world originate from the Arab world. And the Arab world, the Arabs themselves, look at themselves as superior to the non-Arab Muslims. The Koran is in Arabic, it came to Arabia. The people of Arabia were what we call in Judaism the chosen people, etc. So there is also a lot of mutual effect between the Arab world and Africa, especially that in modern times, especially after World War II, much of the Islamic developments in Africa are influenced by Saudi Arabia. The Saudis give most of the money to build mosques. They send plenty of missionaries to teach, to indoctrinate, and to found charities, and they are very influential in other parts of the Muslim world as well, but also in Africa. And the second collaboration between these mutual influence is the fact that we are dealing with the Islamic and Arab sociocultural attitude towards women, which is one of the most important criteria to check the advance of a society, the progress of a society. Now, just to let you some data about, I don't want to exhaust you with data and too much information, too many numbers. According to the most updated report, a very large report published by UNICEF in July 2013, only less than half a year ago, which was also the most comprehensive report and research done by anybody until now. It covers 29 African and Arab countries. According to the report, there are now about 125 million girls and women who underwent this practice. This is a huge number. Of course, there is a difference between different countries and sometimes within the countries themselves, between tribes, regions, etc. But we are talking also, we have to take into consideration that we are talking about countries where this practice is in many cases executed in regions where accurate statistic is limited. Because another report is talking about 150 million. But anyway, we understand that we are facing a big problem that is damaging every year millions of very young girls and young women. We are talking about at least between 1/3 to 40% of the females in the countries that were surveyed. It should also be mentioned that most of these girls or women are in Africa, in both sides of Africa, in West Africa and in East Africa. Interestingly, we hardly find this practice executed in the southern part of Africa, either in the Republic of South Africa or some of the countries north to South Africa. So this is a practice carried out mainly in the northern part of Africa, West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, and of course parts of the Arab world that much of the influence came also from there. I will just quote several examples from the report. In Egypt, we talk about 27.2 million females that undertook this practice, who are 91% of the Egyptian female population. This is an enormous number. In Ethiopia, they found 23.8 million, 74% of the females. In Somalia, 6.5 million, who are 98% of the females. In Djibouti, 62 of mutilated girls underwent the practice between the ages of 5 to 9. In many cases, in high proportions, many of these women, when are asked, answer that they think that this is part of religion. They don't look at it as some kind of an ancient ritual coming from, some say it's from the days of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, even though we don't have any remains, not in statues or in paintings from ancient Egypt about this practice. The only practical improvement regarding this practice, a kind of a small comfort, is that in the past decade, growing number of these acts are executed or take place in some countries in hospitals or any other medical clinics, or by professional medical staff. Especially in Egypt, it takes place more and more by medical professionals, because the government is pushing hard to do it. But in the Yemen, for example, 97% of the girls were cut at home, and 75% of them with unsterilized tools. But what should seriously worry us is also the statistics of women and girls that support the continuation of the practice and the social acceptance they frequently provide for their support. If virginity in those parts of the world is in many cases a condition to be married, we should add the genital mutilation as another important virtue. Now, I would like also to ask why this subject and why now? Why this subject? Because, as I opened with explaining that this is one, as part of the attitude towards women in general in the Arab and Muslim world, especially in Africa, and sometimes among Muslim and African communities in the West. This is a criterion to measure a progress, a social progress. Secondly, because Islam, on one hand, most of these women believe that this is an Islamic duty. It comes from religion. Even though, by the way, I didn't mention it, but in some African countries, we find also Christians that cut their daughters, or Christian mothers, or at least in certain tribes that officially they are Christians. I had an exchange of emails with a senior cleric from the Anglican Church in London and asking him about it, and he admitted that at least he could talk as an Anglican on behalf of the Anglican Church. He admitted they cannot that they cannot fight this phenomenon. They are aware that it exists also among Christians, but they cannot fight it. So it's obvious that we should raise at least our voices against this phenomenon, but first of all to bring it more and more to the public awareness. And why now? Now because at least in the past 2 years there is a growing awareness of Muslims in general and women in particular to the urgent need to improve their situation. Social change in these regions takes place very slowly. With the rise of modern Salafism, for primarily the global jihadi one, with growing influence of Wahhabism, with growing conflicts between Muslims and Christians, for example in Nigeria, in Somalia and Ethiopia, or Egypt, with growing conflicts between religious and national secular elements, such as in Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Somalia, Mali, and growing development of secular liberal female organizations in the socio-cultural field. With all that, the struggle of women in such society receives much more and more significance and drags also more socio-political awareness in the West. Radical new female groups in the West mainly, like Female, and the quick development of social networks in the internet become more powerful with their protest against injustice for females in various regions of the world, including the Arab world, like the case of the Tunisian Amina Tyler. The new wave of struggle of Saudi women to allow them to drive with no male escort, which took place this month as part of a continuous struggle of many years, receives also an international awareness and support. Like the echoes of the struggle against the veil in Europe few years ago. Following a new report on FGM in the United Kingdom, we witnessed just this month, and even these days, a very lively public debate on the abuse of Muslim women and girls in general, and FGM in particular. However, one of the problems is that this debate takes place not among Muslim publics, but among Christian publics, or Western publics, or Western and Christian NGOs. Another reason to raise it now is the fact that Arab and African governments and the new NGOs, with a push from the United Nations and Western governments and NGOs, are more willing to fight some of the unjust phenomena included in the general attitudes towards women. Some of these fights are also influenced by other social conflicts over abortion, trade of women, or same-sex marriages, where women are intensively involved. In December 2012, the General Assembly of the United Nations issued a decision to prohibit all aspects of the practice of FGM. Only 3 Arab and African governments, Egypt, Tunisia, and Kenya, issued the same decision and accepted the UN decision. So we can witness in 2012 and 2013 growing awareness, but the silence of the Muslim clerics is still there, and nothing is being done. Now, we have to take into consideration, and I am not just analyzing it from my point of view, but from the analysis of fatwas, of Islamic rulings, or answers by clerics, and you can find all of them written either on the internet or in books of fatwas. The same as circumcision for boys is an Islamic duty. Their interpretations of few hadith stories, that some of them are considered weak, it is an honor for the women to be mutilated that way. However, we have to take into consideration that religions, all religions, were developed from the point of view of males, not of females. And in the regions we are talking about, the northern part of Africa and of course the Arab world, the sublime virtue is honor. And in many cases, maybe all of them, the honor is linked above everything else to the female members of the family. And if it is linked to the female members of the family, we should first of all cover her as much as possible, then limit her as much as possible, and then hurt her in a manner in which she wouldn't enjoy sex and wouldn't be lusty. And therefore, it's all connected, and clerics of all kinds, of all trends, more liberal and of course less liberal, tend to run away from this problem, tend to avoid a clear-cut reply or answer, not to mention fight this phenomenon. So, unfortunately, as much as we shall talk about it in the West, I at least, and I know that it's a very sad conclusion or very pessimistic conclusion, I cannot see, at least in the near future, any change, and it will also delay many of the possibilities of social change, both in the Arab world and Africa. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Reuven Paz for his important, although sorrowful phenomena. And let us hope that his call to leaders and organizations to struggle against this phenomena will have results. I would like now to call Dr. Nachum Shiloh, Tel Aviv University.
Not yet doctor.
Not yet doctor, but I think on the way.
I hope in 2 to 3 months, but not yet.
Okay. From Tel Aviv University and Gulf Markets Intelligence Limited. His lecture is on cash and Crescent, Islamic finance in the African continent. Mr. Nachum Shiloh is an expert in Islamic finance, Islamic movements, and the GCC states. He is the founder and the CEO of Gulf Markets Intelligence Limited, a company specializing in issues related to business, intelligence, and business development in the GCC states. Mr. Shiloh is about to finish his PhD in Tel Aviv University. His dissertation deals with Allied shifts in Saudi Arabia in the 20th century. Please.
Could I have the lights on? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I want to thank Dr. Salisha Avar and Dr. Moshe Terdman for this great initiative and for inviting me to speak about this issue. Well, the issue of Islamic finance in the African continent is very interesting, very challenging, and in order to understand it perfectly, we first of all have to figure out what Islamic finance is. So let's say that generally speaking, Islamic finance is the financial system consistent with the principles, provisions, and prohibitions of the Islamic law, the Sharia. And in the center of this system stands the prohibition, the strict prohibition, the Quranic strict prohibition on charging interest. The Quran threatens the believers that whoever charges interest will be punished fil dunya wa fil akhirah, in this world and in the next world. So, and whoever doesn't charge interest will be awarded. So, Islamic finance deals with other issues, and there are other bans and prohibitions except of charging interest. All of the things that are immoral, like pornography, alcohol, pork, are strictly prohibited in Islamic finance. So what can we do in Islamic finance? If we cannot charge interest, there are other mechanisms that Islamic finance deals in order to make money, because it is legal, it is permitted to make money and to perform commerce. In Islam, it is not legal to charge interest. So there are, we give 4 to 6 mechanisms that Islamic finance uses. There are more than 30, but I want to focus on the main. We have the murabaha, which is markup trading. It's not charging interest, although the banks get extra money, because it's the markup is fixed, it is known. We have the musharaka, which is profit and loss sharing. I am the client, you are the bank. Me and you get in a joint venture. If we make money, we share the money. If we lose money, we share the losses. We have mudaraba, which is a venture capital funding. The bank provides the finance, the entrepreneur provides the expertise, the management and labor, and then risks and the profits are shared. We have ijara, which is leasing, like the bank buys an item for the client, leases to the client for an agreed period of time, and when the time is up, the client has the choice whether to purchase the good or not. or to continue the leasing. And there are other mechanisms, very controversial ones, the Tawawuk and the Sukuk, which are more complicated, and it's debatable, and we will not get into it because it's very complicated. But in Tawawuk, it's let's say it's a circular deal in which the client buys a share in a commodity owned by the bank sells the client's share to a third party and puts the deposit in the client's account. And we have the Sukuk, which are the Islamic bonds. As we know, in Islam, we cannot charge interest, so the bond is actually some kinds of profits and another kind of profit and loss sharing, but for a debt of somebody else, creating ownership in an asset and so on. Islamic finance has advantages and problems. In the advantages, we can say that it's as a large clientele. Everybody can be a client of an Islamic bank, not necessarily a Muslim. As a Jew or a Christian, I can also be a client of an Islamic bank. And the Islamic bank protects the poor people because it cannot charge the interest over overdraft. If the client owes the bank money, the bank cannot charge him interest. Islamic finance is very quick in solving, in executing ventures, and especially in solving disputes, which I mean that there are no legal deliberations and legal debates where they go to an arbitrator. Over 95% of Islamic deals are, if there is a problem or a controversy, they go to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator makes his rule. Islamic finance is highly flexible. It enhances liquidity because the trades and the deals are quick, very simple, and not for long term, and it has innovations. But there are problems with long-term ventures, like for 30 or 40 years, let's say mortgages. There are problems because the issue of interest may appear. Islamic finance depends on fatwas, and this is one of the biggest problems. There can be, let's say, one happened in Qatar that a certain sheikh said that the stocks of the gas company cannot be purchased because it deals with the Americans, the infidels, and the shares fell 40% in a day, and the same day they bought Sheikh Qaradawi to the TV on prime time, which said the opposite, and the shares rose up 60%. So there is problems with liquidity and solvency risks, client delinquency, and transparency problems. One of the problems is that Islamic bank has a management, but also a Sharia board. And the Sharia board has the last word, and sometimes it contradicts the management, and sometimes we have one member of the Sharia board which serves in other Sharia boards of other banks, which makes a conflict of interest, as we know. And there's a problem that the Sharia finance does not have unified codes. For example, the Sharia finance in Saudi Arabia is not like the Sharia finance in Malaysia. I happened to give a lecture last year in Cambridge in an Islamic finance panel, and there were Saudis and Malaysians. And when the Saudis spoke, the Malaysians objected, and when the Malaysian lecturer spoke about his the kind of Islamic finance practice in Malaysia, the Saudi just raised up and called him, "You are an infidel. Your kind of Islamic finance is infidel." So, well, there are several milestones worth mentioning in Islamic finance. There were attempts to promote Islamic finance in the early 1960s. In Nasser's Egypt, but of course Nasser was suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood and considered Islamic finance as an attempt to overthrow his government, so he shut up the banks. In the 1970s were successful attempts by Gulf banks in Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Kuwait to start Islamic banks. In the 1980s, Islamic banks expanded over all the Islamic world, and since 1995 we are talking about a global phenomenon of Islamic banking. For example, in the UK, which is, as we know, it's a non-Muslim country, Muslims are only 4% of the population. The UK is one of the Islamic finance superpowers in the world, and the government of the UK changed all the laws and regulations of taxation and banking systems in order to introduce Islamic finance. So today we have nearly 500 Islamic banks and financial institutions. operating worldwide. The main centers are the GCC states, Malaysia, the United Kingdom, and now even in Asia. For example, Japan, with the Muslim population is 0.08%, open Islamic banks. So Islamic banking is an industry which grows in 10 to 15% annually, and starts to form several institutions in order to unify the code of Islamic banking. We have Islamic finance not only in banks, but also in insurance, in credit, in securities, and in all kinds of financial activity. Okay, so let's get to the point of Islamic finance in Africa, because it's a relatively new phenomenon. We can say that since the late 1990s, the Islamic finance or Sharia finance or Islamic banking entered Africa, and it is expanding rapidly in this continent. We are talking about 10 to 15% of expansion in the volume of Islamic money. It's now only 2 to 5% of all the assets in Africa, but if it grows by 15% a year, it will grow to other figures in very few years. We have 3 arenas in Africa which Islamic finance is flourishing, and which is North Africa, the Nile Valley, and West Africa. Let's say North Africa. North Africa is, most of the countries are Muslims, Arab Muslims, and surprisingly, until the Arab Spring, they didn't have, except of Egypt and Sudan, they didn't have Islamic finance. We had secular regimes in Libya, in Tunisia, in Morocco, which banned Islamic banking, and because they feared the Islamic extremism, and they wanted to promote secularism. But after the Arab Spring, all these governments that replaced the overthrown regimes, like in Libya and Tunisia, opened Islamic banks, and even the Moroccan government, which was not overthrown, had to get let's say a deal with the opposition in order to make the opposition silent. And one of the fruits that the opposition received was the opening of the inauguration of the Islamic banking system. In today Egypt, there is a struggle, the army versus the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Islamic banking is an issue in this fight. So let's go to the Nile Valley. We'll take a few examples. For example, Ethiopia. What I want you to pay attention is that the percentage of Muslims in every country that I speak about. Because in Ethiopia we have 63% Christians and only 34% Muslims. But since 2008, the National Bank of Ethiopia acted in favor of introducing Islamic banking and Islamic finance, and it went on. But at a certain point, the government put the brakes, because it was under influence of anti-Islamic groups that say that Islamic finance is dangerous, Islamic finance promotes extremism. That's what they said, and the Ethiopian government said, okay, we will not open Islamic banks, we will open Islamic windows in banks, because we don't have to start in a bank, we can do a window, then a branch, then promote it to a bank. So that was happened in Ethiopia. If we take Kenya, for example, Kenya is a Christian country, 83% Christians, only 11% Muslims, but the government and the Central Bank of Kenya, they are promoting Islamic finance vigorously. They said they are supporting it, and there are already 2 Islamic banks in Kenya, and both of them marked three-digit growth in recent years. Kenya is a huge financial hub, not only in Islamic finance, but it wants to promote Islamic finance and to serve as a gateway of Islamic finance to Africa. In Kenya, the expansion of Islamic banking in Kenya is affecting the Kenyan neighbors like Tanzania and Uganda. But these 2 countries are far beyond the reach of Islamic banks today, because they don't have the resources that Kenya has. So what is interesting in the Nile Valley is the question why Islamic banking is flourishing in the Nile Valley. There are several explanations, but one good explanation is the involvement of the Gulf states, the GCC states, As I said earlier in my presentation, the GCC states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, they are Islamic superpowers, Islamic finance superpowers, and they are involved in agriculture and other ventures in the African continent and in the Nile Valley, and especially they want to purchase land. The Saudi Arabia and Qatar purchased vast territories of land, of fertile land, in order to grow food and to ship the food back to the Gulf. And we are talking about billions, deals in billions of dollars. And one of the consequences is that Islamic banking is coming with the Saudis and with the Qataris to the Nile Valley countries, and is part of the deals of the Gulf food security. So this is one of the reasons. There are, of course, other reasons why Islamic banking is flourishing in the Nile Valley. So let's go to West Africa. In West Africa, the most interesting case study is Nigeria. Nigeria is split on almost 50-50 between Muslims and Christians. Muslims and the northern states are Muslims, the southern states are Christians. Nigeria was the first sub-Saharan country in Africa to introduce Islamic banking in 1997, because it was promoting the Islamic banks. And there were problems because the central bank of Nigeria authorized the Islamic banking, and they call it free interest banks. But suddenly we had a break in 2012 when the High Court in Abuja held an order that Islamic banking or Sharia or interest-free banking is against the Constitution. This decision by the federal court was taken by surprise by many experts who thought that nothing that can happen, but it happened. But despite the ruling, Sharia finance is not stopping in Nigeria, but expanding. And if we want to summarize the claims by both opponents and supporters of Sharia finance in Nigeria, the opponents say if we introduce Sharia finance, then it means the Islamization of Nigeria. And if we introduce Sharia finance, it will promote Islamic extremism, and it will discriminate non-Muslims. And the supporters of Sharia finance say, no way. Sharia finance and Islam are not terrorism. And Islamic finance will boost the economy, and it's very crucial for the Nigerian economy, and for that it should be introduced. And it has nothing to do with terrorism. And those who say that it's nothing to do with terrorism brings, for example, a case from 2013 in which the Jaiz Islamic Bank, one of the Islamic banks in Nigeria, gave financial help to families of victims of the Boko Haram attacks. There are other examples. Ghana, for example, is also introducing Islamic finance in West Africa. Ghana does not have Islamic banks, but Islamic microfinance institutions. Other examples are Democratic Republic of Congo, in which Islamic banks are purchasing land. We have South Africa with only 2% of Muslim population, which introduced Islamic finance by changing the taxation law. And Islamic finance is on the brink of entering Djibouti, Mali, Benin, Mozambique, and Zambia. In order to conclude, we can say that Islamic finance entered Africa is expanding rapidly, 10 to 15% a year. The expansion of Islamic banking in sub-Saharan Africa emphasizes again the global characteristics of Islamic finance. We have several arenas, a special arena in Africa which is expanding more rapidly, which is the Nile Valley because of the Gulf state involvement, the West Africa, and of course the Muslim state of North Africa. And as we saw in the Nigerian case, Islamic banking in some African countries, Ethiopia and Nigeria, is in the middle of the Christian-Muslim conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nachum Shiloh, and we wish you success on your PhD.
Thank you.
Now we are passing to the last speaker in this panel, Dr. Haim Koren, the ambassador of Israel to South Sudan. He will speak on state and society, economy, and environment in the Sudanese fabric. Haim Koren served in Nepal, Egypt, USA, as well as various postings at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Currently, Ambassador of Israel to South Sudan, the first ambassador of Israel in Southern Sudan.
Okay.
And from the coming summer, Ambassador of Israel to Egypt. We wish you the best of success.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
תודה.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a long and heavy day, so when I speak Ari, how long should I speak? He's told me you can speak as long as you want. In 10 minutes, everybody is leaving. So I'll try to do it as short as I can. The subject is pretty heavy. I'll try to simplify it a little bit. And if you're still alive and well, maybe you can have questions later on. I really want to do it as quick as I can. I decided to speak about the Sudanese fabric because basically Sudan is divided to three. And a lot of speakers today touched the point that the mixture of religious, tribal societies and colonialism created a very, very interesting creatures in Africa. So Sudan had it all because the main side of Sudan, which is concentrated near Khartoum or Oman, based on population that ethnically they are Arab and by their religion they are Muslims. That's very important because in terms of identity they feel that they belong to the Middle East and not to Africa. That's very, very important to understand. It was raised up before in a different connotation, but the fact that Egypt is Sudan considered by the leaders of Sudan, of Khartoum, as being part of the Arab world is very, very good. The other, and by the way, needless to say that the Arabs are minority within the population of Sudan. The population of Sudan of today is around 40 million people. South Sudan, which is in the same fabric, is another 9 to 10 million, so altogether it's less than 15 million. The western part of it, as emphasized here, as you see Darfur, but with all factions, it's the size, basically the size of France, a little bit bigger, and we're talking also about more than 10 million people. By their religions, they are Muslim. I elaborate on that in a minute, but they are African, they're not Arabs. It's very important to understand. In the south, we're talking about all of the population are African, mostly Christian for 7 denominations, from Catholic to Anglicans to Baptist. It depends in what and where the European missionaries succeeded to arrive to. And some of them are enemies and a small percentage of Muslims there. Still, you can find some mosques in Juba and elsewhere. So, but basically the population are African as well as in Darfur, but Christian. So we have a split of 3 main populations all over the Sudan. Historically, Sudan suffered 2 colonialism periods. One was the Turco-Egyptian, or Turkiya, what they call, from 1820. Later on, we came to the era of Mahdiya, which mentioned here before in the connection to Sufism. And later on, there was a British condominium, part of this mandate system all over Middle East and Africa. that actually brought Sudan with independence in '56, the last or the latest among the countries in the Middle East, because as I said before, Sudan considered as part of the Middle East and not necessarily part of Africa. Because of the turmoil and the conflict between those ethnic groups within Sudan, and I simplified it as much as I can because it's much more complicated, and I only touched the tribal system and the issue of conversion to Islam and ethnology. It brings to a conflict from the very beginning, even a year before the independence. Civil war started between the Arab Muslim in the north to the Christian blacks at the south in 1955. Sudan got independent in 1956. So in fact, we have a war between the north and the south even before the independence. Just to give you some figures, this war cost more than 2 million dead and more 2 million people. Think about it. You cannot ignore it when you come to bring to account the feelings of the people there and the involvement, not talking about refugees, which you mentioned today, for example, in Kenya, the refugee camps in Kenya during the years, and also what we see since the beginning of the 2000s in Chad and Darfur, contains thousands and thousands of people and not solved yet. So that is the situation. So if you're talking about more than 2 million people that killed, and many refugees are still not settled after so many years, and the tensions between at least 3 factions of the population, you get immediately problems that go on and on. Now, to make it a little bit more complicated, let me try to explain that the people of the West, namely Darfur area, who are African by origin, got to a process of conversion to Islam in the last 100 years, in a process that started in what we call in Islam the spread of Sufism of Islam. It started in the 16th century in Sudan and elsewhere, but started in Sudan, but spread out in a very significant way in the last, let's say, 200 years, as it's seen in Darfur. We can find it also in Nigeria, we can find it also in Senegal, but the pattern of spread of Sufi Islam, it's well known in that part of Africa as well as in Turkey, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. His vice-man is here, he's not here anymore. Because if you understand that and you realize how Sufism started to penetrate into Africa, I'll do it really as short as I can, just to give you the structure of penetrating of the Sufism into Africa. When you have a tribal system in Sudan, for example, and the chief of the tribe is well known by his ability for healing, to bring rain and so on, and all those other rituals that he does in his tribe, as much as he is influential and charismatic and successful, his tribe getting bigger and stronger politically, socially, and economically. When Sufism, and again, Tim made a very nice elaboration of the structure of the Sufi orders all over Africa. I don't want to go into it. I only say that Sufism that started in the 7th century, both in Sunni and Shia, is a very, very basic way of worshipping God for those people who are not going to be very sophisticated. In other words, and I apologize for the superficial explanation here, that deserves a full seminar in the university of 1 year. But the fact that shepherds used to go with their herds and didn't have time and the attention to work Allah and it's supposed to be, enables them to pray for God 5 times a day as requested in Islam, but to do it in a very basic way, pay attention that they were illiterate, most of them. So if somebody brings them a new phenomenon of belief that actually concentrate in appreciation one God and using actually old ritual that they used to have. In other words, if we talk about a chief that used to lead his tribe, and now we're talking about sheikh that knows how to bring grain to the people, make healing to the people, and also knowing to read and write in Arabic and explain the Quran in a very basic way. That's a very easy way that Islam can spread in its Sufi form around Sudan and elsewhere in Africa, because actually he didn't change anything of the social structure and tribal structure of the tribe, because the same leader that used to be called chief before is called sheikh now. So I myself in my research found that in Darfur, when some guy found a sultan, not a sheikh, a sultan in Darfur in the 18th century, worshipped to a cat, he asked him, how come you're a sultan? He said, no problem, we believe in that, and we believe in that as well, and we can live peacefully with that. I emphasize this point because in many Sufi orders, tariqas, as we say in Africa, they order the tribe, the family, it became later on united in the same social political power as in Sudan. And later on, even before the time of the Mahdi, the name of the leader came to the tribe. Like Mahdi was before, as you stated, in Samania, which was not a very big Sufi order, but when it became the Mahdiya, that became the leading force, political, social, in Sudan. And later on, when Sudan got independent, when the first prime minister and immediately the first capital State General Aboud immediately made a party called Ummah. The consequences and the name Ummah immediately brings us to the Quran, to the Ummah al-Islamiyah. And that is a Mahdi party up till now. And Sadiq al-Mahdi, the grandson of the great Mahdi, led and still leading the party even now. When we're talking about the Khatmiya, Mirghani, the second holy family and Sufi order and social power and political power went to the parliament, they called it the Ansar, also from the Quran. So what we get in Sudan, in fact, is a combination of a tribal, political, social power that concentrates and led by Arab in the north, in Khartoum and area, and actually dictate the policy from the all over Sudan in that kind of spirit. And that is very, very important to understand. Now I'll run very quickly on the history in order to understand where we're standing now. So if we're talking about minority of Arab who controlled Sudan for many years, with identity of being Arabs, and you translate it to the pattern that we know on the sub-Saharan Africa, we take it from the west, from Mauritania, Senegal, all the way to the Red Sea in the east, you find out very quickly a long conflict between Arabs and Africans bringing into intention that most of the slave traders were Arab in Africa, especially in Sudan, when we remember Abu Rahman Zubair, who was very well known about slavery and merchandise in that part of Africa. Now, needless to say that slavery in Sudan still exists now. The law against slavery made by British in 1877 was very nice and it was written on the paper, but when it comes into being, it's not working. We're talking also about children enslavement today. That means that the tension between people, especially Christian African from the south to the North Arab Muslim, it's almost built in the relationship between those two societies. If I add Darfur to the west to this issue, again, people who used to be Christian, those who know the history of Sudan, especially in the west, in the kingdoms of Awa and Akura, that used to be Christian kingdoms before, that by the time converted to Islam, in its that specific Sunni pattern, they also were discriminated by the Arabs who were supposed to be Muslim as well as those people from Darfur, from the west. So you get immediately one nation state, artificial of course, that contains so many tensions in one place that you cannot contain and you cannot control almost at the time. So what happened during the immediate, or I would say on the chronological line from the independence up till now? How long, how many times I have?
2 minutes.
That's all? So I do it really telegraphically. As I said, right in the independence 56, General Abu took power. Later on, and made coalition with the traditional forces that I elaborated on before, namely Mahdiya, Khatmiya, the Communist Party that also were a Sufi order that became a party and so on. That went on basically till the 60s, the end of the 60s. You probably remember, those who are with white hair like me, that after the Six-Day War in June 67, there was the Arab Summit that called the famous Arab Summit called the Summit of the Three No's. No for recognition, no for negotiation, no for peace. That took place in Khartoum. The famous Arab Summit in Khartoum after the Six-Day War showed the obligation of the Sudanese to the Arab line, which basically stayed because for the Arabs in the Sudan, that's the main component of their identity. They are first of all Arabs. They are not African, they are Arabs. It's very important to understand. What happened during the 60s, that a guy named Hassan al-Turabi, who was a guy that graduated University of Khartoum at the Gordon College at the time, in law, became later on, he went to Oxford to have to complete his MA degree in international law, and then to the Sorbonne to have his PhD. When he came back as a lecturer in the University of Khartoum in early 70s, he became a well-known radical Sunni intellectual that was known also outside of the Sudan. Namely, he was considered one of those theologians who are well known in the Arab radical Sunni world. Like when we were talking about the Sheikh who is now in Qatar, and you see it often in Al Jazeera, Yusuf Qaradawi, and some other, or Rashid Ranushi, who now came back to Tunisia after exile in London after so many years, and he's the same. They have a lot of writing, and that's why you can actually follow them very carefully. Turabi is important to that sense because he started as a very soft-spoken Muslim theologist, and by the time during the 70s and the 80s, he became more and more radical. If at the beginning he wrote about the status of the women and enabled them to vote in the election, and the right of the minorities in the Sudan, when you get into the end of the 80s, he became so radical that the whole idea of taking care about the right of women, the right of minorities, vanished. He became more and more radical. I just remind you shortly that in 79, the radical revolution in Iran took place and immediately wanted to be exported to Africa through Sudan. It doesn't cover the Sunni-Shiite split that exists, but conjecturally they would work together. And in the 80s, he became very close to the leader of Al-Qaeda at the time. Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden. He hosted Bin Laden in Sudan for 2 years and gave his own people diplomatic passport and so on. That meant that by the time he was so influential in Sudan, he was recruited by Numeri to be his Minister of Waqf, and later on, by marriage to the sister of Saad al-Mahdi, he became more and more in the coalition till the coup d'etat of Bashir. Actually, the guy who ran Sudan was Hassan Turabi and not Bashir. And Turabi brought this extreme ideology that told the people of Darfur, I remind you that they were Muslim as well as the Arabs in the north, but still they were African. He said to them, your conversion to Islam as Sufi is not true, is not good. If you want to be true good Muslim, you have to convert the way I recommend to you to do. In another word, in a more radical way. If you won't do it, we'll take care of it. But the real issue was that Turabi represented the Arabs against the African community in Darfur. So when it came to the genocide in 2003, 2005, I just remind you, almost 500,000 people crashed. They had to burn. They raped the women. They destroyed everything by gingerweed. There was not because they were not true Muslims. That's because the Arab wanted to take the place of the blacks. And we're talking about environment. The gingerweed, that was a militia that was headed by Sudanese government, tried to take the lands from the people, the farmers in Darfur, and get rid of them. And that was a very good opportunity in the beginning of the millennium to do it, because the people of Darfur said, if you're going to an agreement with the South, what about us? We are discriminated against more time and in a very brutal way, more than the South. What about us? So the situation right now, we're talking not about two Sudans and geopolitically recognized, because South Sudan got its independence in 2011, but in fact we're speaking about three Sudan. Three Sudan, the West, Khartoum, and the South. The fact that the West or Darfur belong to the Sudanese state, that's very interesting, but when it comes to their relationship, you can find very easily that militias from Darfur helping to the South, which now is a different independent country, to attack militias in northern Sudan. Is it complicated enough, or should I add more components? Now, I didn't have even time to mention the neighbors of Sudan, the Son of Representatives sitting here. If you're talking about Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Central African Republic that's surrounding South Sudan, you can understand that the population of those countries and South Sudan is much more closer than the population of South Sudan, the population of Sudan. That's why IGAD and the countries around supported any kind of separation of South Sudan from Sudan, unlike Egypt and Libya. Egypt because of the Nile, Libya because of Arab identification, to enable Sudan to be one united, weak Sudan under Bashir that will maintain the interests of Egypt and Libya. Libya is not there anymore. Egypt is in a different situation. So we have facing now a total new situation. So what we get out of it, Allahu A'lam, as we said. We'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this is the end of this panel. This is the end of this panel. Maybe about conversion, I just want to add something. I remember that there is a tribe, Giryama, near Mombasa, and they are although they are very near to the Islamic center, they stuck to their traditional religion. So one time I went to a Sufi sheikh, which is converting. I wanted to see how he's doing it. So one of the Giryama people came and he said, I want to convert to Islam. So we said, okay, he has got a block of papers in which the Shahada was written, and then down it's written, I want to be converted to Islam. And he did not know to read and write, so we gave him with his finger to sign it, and he signed it, and then he became a Muslim. So I asked him, how he doesn't know anything. He said, I don't mind about him. His children will be very good Muslims. So, question. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Reuven for raising our awareness on FDN.
You're welcome.
But I have a question.
Only one.
Only one. Is it not more advisable to consider FDN as a harmful traditional practice than related with religions? Because, let me take a case in my country, Ethiopia, where you have a very big majority of Orthodox Christians, like 50 to 55%. Out of these 55%, about half undergo FDN, half they don't accept it. Also in the Muslim communities these days, what we are witnessing is a highly declining practice of FDN. I'm not sure whether this 74% data this case is the real data. On the Islamic finance in Africa. I would like also to thank Mr. Nachum.
Yes.
What we know, thank you. What we know from our practice is that the commercial bank is often a window for those Muslims who do not accept to take interest. It is just catering the government. 100% using a local resources. Do you ever know about this?
What again? Can you repeat?
You know, there are no Islamic banks in Egypt. You have already, I think you have mentioned that. But there is a window for Muslims at the commercial bank of Egypt that caters particularly Muslims, those who don't take interest. So, do you have the recent information about this?
Well, I haven't heard about the specific commission, but of course it's Islamic windows. You have it's very easy to open Islamic windows, much easier than Islamic bank. It's not, you don't need all the regulations. So it's
maybe I should almost relate it. First of all, I want to thank the panel for a very nice presentation and for the figure manipulation. I think the data as was presented, it was sad that it ended in not in an optimistic way, but pessimistic a little, but I would want to say that you are right, in Kenya it's succeeded and the government is really behind it. And this is a success story, say in Kenya, which I think should be emulated by others in other areas. I do not believe it is purely because of religion. I think there is also tradition. And I think the matter of this enunciated. So there are these voices. I mean, do you have any information regarding therapy? Thank you.
Well, first,
Yes, my question has to do with the issue of non-payment of interest with respect to Islamic banking. Now, if I understand the concept of payment of interest in normal Western banking, okay, you borrow a certain amount of money from the bank, and then you pay back with interest. Now, if one borrows money from an Islamic bank, and you are not going to pay back interest, I would expect that if I borrow $100, I should pay back $100. But if by the time I borrow $100, then I make a profit of $200, and I have $300, and I'm going to pay you back $400, and then you are going to share in my profit, you are probably even worse than the conventional bank. So I want clarification on that, on the issue of you borrow money, and then the bank now is going to partake and share your profit, while you are still going to return the initial capital. Thank you.
I'll try to answer the question. There are no questions.
Thank you very much, sirs, for very lucid presentations. My question is very simple, and that goes to Mr. Koren. You talked of militia in Darfur coming to the rescue of people in the south. Do you see a merger in future? But I know this is a very sensitive question. Do you see a merger between Darfur and South Sudan, for instance?
Thank you for the question. There is conjunctural cooperation between the West and the South. Khartoum doesn't like it. They blame Salva Kiir of using Darfurians against him by militias in attacks on the north. The South denies it totally. Now, the relationship between the West and the South are only because of the common enemy that they have. Enemy is a strong word because Sudan recognized South Sudan first when Bashir came to the celebration of the independence and so on, and then the Sudanese ambassador in Juba is #1 player. You should know that. So there are relationships, and who knows better than our Ethiopian colleague that whenever needed any kind of mediation between the two Sudans, they come into Addis Ababa in order to, because they all believe in Ethiopia in an even-handed mediator. So there are connections, but there's still a very, very deep concern of mistrust between the parties. Take the issue of the pipeline of the oil, the production of the oil that goes out from Port Sudan, the fighting on the currency about any barrel, the price about the stopping of the flowing the oil now from May, the beginning of flowing again and so on. So there is mistrust. So the policy of Darfur, and it's very clear, is not to get independence. They would like to keep on being part of Sudan. There's no question about it. The only thing that they don't want to be discriminated against, and it happened not long ago in this genocide action. They claim very urgently from the world to do something about it, which in fact the world doesn't do much about it. As you all know, the ICC looking for Harun and for Bashir, and Bashir goes to Kuwait and goes elsewhere, nobody stops him to do so. But the targets are different, and it's not a secret that there are parts on the south that still believe on the vision of John Garang that they would like to control all Sudan under Christian hegemony, unlike it used to be in the past. Most of them are accepting the reality. South Sudan is rich enough, has resources, can have an independent state, no problem. But there are some people thinking that it means. Now, regarding to the Ethiopian ambassador question about the relationship or the tribal overlapping between, for example, in East Equatoria, on the area between Ethiopia and South Sudan, they're more complex because we're not talking about the dichotomical shift between Christianity and Islam. We all know that people in South Sudan are pretty good Christians, that they are married for 10 women, 10 wives. There's no problem. I don't see elsewhere that Catholics are unable to marry more than one wife. And so on. With their mixture of the culture, it's not strictly the way it is. That's why when Turabi demanded from the West, and the West claimed we have our own habits and our own customs, we could do modern, but we don't accept the hegemony that Turabi wants to dictate to us. We mentioned a few times today, there are many patterns of Islam all over the world, and you're not supposed to follow only one, the most extremist one, and that's what Turabi demands for them. That's why they are so angry. And if we mentioned before the Jews that behave terribly in Darfur, you all remember that during the 80s, what they called Rahilin were in South Sudan, the same pattern. The government of Khartoum said we have nothing to do with them, but that was the militia of the government in order to kill thousands all the time. And if you want to bring the situation today, you can see what happened in Jonglei area, for example, where David Yahya, who are going against Salva Kiir, supported by Bashir, by the area of South Sudan, the killings are going on and on. I mean, the whole world talking about catastrophe, disaster, but that kind of a combination of tribal, social, and political, if you like, international politics, that concentrating on one area that creates a lot of troubles between the Sudan. And it exists every day. And I see the UNRWA and other organizations, the NGOs, blaming them in all kinds of human rights issues and so on. And I'm telling to my colleagues, before you come into the issue of human rights, learn what's going on, what the sources, why it came to this situation. So I'm not seeing immediate solution for that, but the process that at least between the South and Khartoum is going on.
Yeah. Sorry, we have to keep time. Therefore, our last and fourth panel will start at 5:45. We have a short break. Yeah.
I'll do it briefly. First of all, I agree that this issue is a mixture. I shouldn't accuse the clerics and the religious circles. It's more a matter of tradition. However, from the point of view of many of the women, as well as the men that support this practice, this is a religious issue. Secondly, clerics should have, if they were not willing to run away from this problem and stand and provide clear answers, they should have let's say, to have much bigger part of this debate and present I didn't have time to analyze all the fatwas that I read, and I read the hundreds of fatwas. Some of them are so ridiculous, but they give very serious clerics, instead of fighting this phenomenon, they give all kinds of justification, and for many publics it becomes part of religion. And by the way, sorry, left. Sorry. As to your question, we see, for example, a different or a struggle in countries like Tunisia and Algeria. But these are also the most secular countries in not only Africa, maybe in the Arab world. Even in Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, where the government fell under the Al-Nahda party, which is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood after all. But I can answer you also, look at all the events and the demonstrations of the Arab Spring, for example, mainly in Egypt. This issue was never raised. Nobody regarded this issue as part of the social protest, as part of the social, or as part of the social fight for human and mainly civil rights.
I didn't mean it exactly during the Arab Spring. I just said that in such countries, where are the women emancipation?
No, so
irrelevant of the Arab Spring.
No, I mentioned it because their voice are too weak. There are institutions. The first to raise the question in the 70s in the Arab world was Dr. Nawal Saadawi in Egypt. But for example, she was a communist. She was a part of the Communist Party. So nobody regarded her seriously.